The coffee was still warm when Sarah Chen vanished. It was February 14th, 2003, a Valentine's Day buried beneath a blizzard that would blanket Millbrook, Michigan in 14 inches of snow. The small farming town, home to just 8,477 souls, had settled into the muffled quiet that only winter storms bring. At 9:47 p.m., Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Elena Vance, stood at her kitchen window waving goodbye as the young nursing student crossed the narrow strip of snow-covered yard between their modest ranch houses. In her gloved hands, Sarah carried a steaming mug, the blue and white checkered ceramic one she'd borrowed earlier that evening, a pattern Mrs. Vance had owned for nearly 3 decades. The older woman watched as Sarah's red winter coat flickered through the swirling snow like a heartbeat against the darkness, until finally she disappeared into the storm. What happened in the 47 minutes that followed would haunt Millbrook for the next 20 years. At 10:34 p.m., Derek Martinez, Sarah's boyfriend, placed a trembling call to the Gracie County Sheriff's Department. His voice broke as he explained to Deputy Wallace that Sarah had gone next door and never come back. At first, he thought she was taking her time, maybe chatting with Mrs. Vance. But as the storm grew fiercer, unease turned to panic. Pulling on his boots, Derek trudged through knee-deep snow to the neighbor's house. Mrs. Vance answered, surprised. She told him Sarah had left almost an hour earlier. Derek sprinted back through the wind and darkness, calling her name. Inside their small rental home, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her purse rested on the kitchen counter, keys beside it. Her phone was still plugged into its charger in the bathroom. The nursing textbook she'd been studying lay open across the dining room table, highlighters uncapped beside a half-finished anatomy assignment due Monday. The front door was locked from the inside. The deadbolt Sarah had insisted they installed after last summer's string of break-ins was firmly engaged. The back door's chain lock remained untouched. Every window was latched tight, sealed with the plastic sheeting Derek had painstakingly applied in November to keep out the cold. Nothing was out of place, except for Sarah. Mrs. Vance could only offer the faint outline of a timeline. They'd shared a brief chat while making hot chocolate. Sarah had seemed cheerful, talking about her Valentine's plans with Derek, tired perhaps from her hospital rotations, but perfectly herself. Their conversation had lasted maybe 15 minutes. Then Sarah had buttoned her red coat, smiled, and stepped into the wind. Somewhere between Mrs. Vance's porch light and her own front door, Sarah Chen disappeared, swallowed whole by the snow and the silence of that Valentine's night. Deputy Wallace had been in law enforcement for 22 years, long enough to know the difference between panic and real fear. He'd seen it all, the late-night domestic disputes that fizzled by morning, the angry lovers who stormed off and returned 2 days later, the young adults who vanished after family fights only to reappear sheepishly when the tension cooled. But standing in Sarah Chen's living room at 11:15 p.m. that night, Wallace felt something different. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. The kind of stillness that makes the air hum, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. Sarah's presence was everywhere. A half-finished coffee mug sat in the sink. Her nursing scrubs hung neatly over the arm of a chair. On the mantel, 3 vanilla-scented candles flickered weakly, their soft glow casting shifting shadows on framed photographs of a smiling young woman who, by all accounts, should have been there. And yet, she wasn't. She was gone, impossibly gone, from a house locked from the inside, in a town where everyone knew each other's business, on a night when even the local bar had closed early under the weight of the blizzard. Wallace felt the prickle of unease crawl up his spine as he began what would become the most confounding investigation of his career. He couldn't have known that the truth lay buried not just beneath the snow, but beneath years of silence and small-town loyalty, waiting 2 decades to rise, and when it did, it would tear apart everything Millbrook believed about trust, safety, and the people it thought it knew. The next morning, at exactly 6 a.m. on February 15th, Sarah's mother, Linda Chen, received the call that would change her life. She was in Lansing getting ready for her early shift at the Ford plant, the smell of instant coffee filling her small kitchen while the morning news murmured in the background. When she answered the phone, Derek's voice, hoarse and broken from a night of shouting Sarah's name into the storm, barely managed to deliver the words that shattered her world. Her daughter was gone. Linda froze, spoon in hand, her body moving through denial before her mind could catch up. Sarah didn't vanish. Sarah was dependable, responsible, the kind of person who kept color-coded calendars and never missed a single clinical shift. She was the girl who called home every Sunday, no matter how tired she was, and who sent flowers on Mother's Day even when she couldn't afford them. Sarah Chen didn't run away. She didn't break promises. She didn't leave people wondering. But as Linda gripped the steering wheel and began the 87-mile drive from Lansing to Millbrook, her car sliding through half-plowed roads, windshield wipers struggling against the freezing wind, something heavy began to settle inside her. A coldness that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. It was the quiet, suffocating certainty that her daughter was not just missing. She was gone, impossibly gone, from a house locked from the inside, in a town where everyone knew each other's business, on a night when even the local bar had closed early under the weight of the blizzard. Wallace felt the prickle of unease crawl up his spine as he began what would become the most confounding investigation of his career. He couldn't have known that the truth lay buried not just beneath the snow, but beneath years of silence and small-town loyalty, waiting 2 decades to rise, and when it did, it would tear apart everything Millbrook believed about trust, safety, and the people it thought it knew. The next morning, at exactly 6 a.m. on February 15th, Sarah's mother, Linda Chen, received the call that would change her life. She was in Lansing, getting ready for her early shift at the Ford plant, the smell of instant coffee filling her small kitchen while the morning news murmured in the background. When she answered the phone, Derek's voice, hoarse and broken from a night of shouting Sarah's name into the storm, barely managed to deliver the words that shattered her world. Her daughter was gone. Linda froze, spoon in hand, her body moving through denial before her mind could catch up. Sarah didn't vanish. Sarah was dependable, responsible, the kind of person who kept color-coded calendars and never missed a single clinical shift. She was the girl who called home every Sunday, no matter how tired she was, and who sent flowers on Mother's Day even when she couldn't afford them. Sarah Chen didn't run away. She didn't break promises. She didn't leave people wondering. But as Linda gripped the steering wheel and began the 87-mile drive from Lansing to Millbrook, her car sliding through half-plowed roads, windshield wipers struggling against the freezing wind, something heavy began to settle inside her. A coldness that had nothing to do with the Michigan winter. It was the quiet, suffocating certainty that her daughter was not just missing. She was gone, and whatever had happened to her was far darker than anyone in Millbrook was ready to imagine. By noon on February 15th, Linda Chen had turned her daughter's small rental house into something that looked more like an operations center than a home. The transformation was swift and instinctive. The moment she crossed the threshold, grief gave way to action. She shoved Derek's gaming chair out of the way, clearing space on the dining room table that only a day earlier had been scattered with Sarah's nursing textbooks and highlighters. In their place, she spread out maps of Gracie County, old, creased ones she found in a drawer by the phone. With a red pen, she began circling every place her daughter might have gone, every field, forest road, or drainage ditch within walking distance. The house still smelled faintly of Sarah, vanilla candles, fabric softener, the ghost of her perfume lingering in the air. But that familiar scent only deepened the ache in Linda's chest. She called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, her voice steady but hollow. An hour later, she called again, this time to tell her supervisor she'd need an indefinite leave of absence. There was no hesitation. Linda had learned, long ago, that systems don't save people. They bury them in paperwork and excuses. She'd seen it firsthand when her husband lay dying in a hospital bed while insurance companies debated his worth in dollars and policy codes. If Sarah was going to be found, it wouldn't be because the world cared. It would be because Linda refused to stop. By the second day, the investigation had already begun to fracture, revealing the fault lines that would shape the next 20 years of unanswered questions. Detective Raymond Ray Morrison had been brought in from the county seat to oversee the case. 28 years on the job, most of them with Detroit homicide, had carved deep lines into his face and deeper skepticism into his voice. He transferred to Gracie County for peace and quiet, not missing girls in red coats. When Linda met him for the first time, she could tell he'd already drawn his conclusions. "Young women don't just vanish from locked houses," he said, arms folded, voice measured but dismissive. "There's always an explanation." Linda stared at him across the table, surrounded by maps and melting snow boots, and felt something inside her hardened. To him, this was another case. To her, it was everything.
Young women have fights with boyfriends, made impulsive decisions, sometimes needed space to think. The locked doors could be explained. Maybe Derek was lying. Maybe Sarah had a key hidden somewhere. Maybe she'd slipped out a window and pulled it shut behind her. Morrison ordered searches of the immediate area, questioned Derek extensively, and waited for Sarah to call home. Linda's faith in official channels began cracking during that first week. Morrison seemed more interested in Derek's financial troubles and their occasional arguments than in the physical impossibility of Sarah's disappearance. When Linda suggested expanding the search area, Morrison reminded her about limited resources and the reality of winter weather. When she pushed for more aggressive questioning of neighbors, he cited proper procedure and the need for evidence. When she begged for media attention that might generate leads, Morrison worried about compromising the investigation. Linda realized she was fighting two battles, finding Sarah and forcing the system to care enough to help. The community response split along similar lines. Sarah's nursing school classmates organized weekend search parties, trudging through snowdrifts and abandoned farmland with the desperate energy of youth confronting mortality. Local churches provided meals and prayer circles, but others whispered different theories. Some wondered about Derek's story, noting his gambling problems and the couple's recent financial stress. Others suggested Sarah might have staged her own disappearance, overwhelmed by school pressures and family expectations. The whispers grew louder when Derek moved back to his parents' house in Grand Rapids after 3 weeks, unable to afford the rent alone and haunted by the silence that had replaced Sarah's laughter. Linda rented a small apartment in Millbrook, determined to maintain a base of operations even as her savings dwindled. She spent mornings canvassing neighborhoods that detectives had already visited, afternoons photocopying missing person flyers at the library, and evenings calling police departments in neighboring counties. Sleep became elusive, food became optional, and every phone call carried the potential to either save or destroy what remained of her world. Linda developed an obsession with details that others dismissed as irrelevant. The exact temperature that night, the precise timeline of Mrs. Vance's testimony, the logistics of Derek's story, the significance of Sarah's abandoned coffee. As February melted into March and search parties dwindled to a handful of die-hard volunteers, Linda began to understand that she was fighting alone, sustained only by a mother's refusal to accept the unacceptable. Millbrook had the kind of secrets that small towns cultivate like prize-winning tomatoes, carefully tended, selectively shared, and fiercely protected from outsiders. When Sarah Chen disappeared, those secrets didn't emerge all at once. Instead, they seeped out gradually, like water through limestone, each revelation adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible case. The Chen investigation exposed fractures in the community that most residents preferred to ignore. At Rosie's Diner, the morning coffee crowd that had gathered religiously for 15 years suddenly found themselves choosing sides. Earl Patterson, who'd lived in Millbrook since 1967 and knew every family's business going back 3 generations, insisted that Derek Martinez had always seemed shifty. Something about the way he looked at people, Earl claimed, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary force. But Dolores McKnight, who taught Sunday school at First Baptist and had watched Derek help elderly parishioners with their groceries, defended the young man with surprising vehemence.
Their debates grew heated enough that Rosie herself had to institute a no Sarah talk during breakfast rush policy. By the end of March, the investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about law enforcement resources in rural Michigan. Gratiot County maintained a force of 12 full-time deputies covering 571 square miles of farmland, small towns, and scattered homesteads. Detective Raymond Morrison was stretched thin before Sarah Chen ever vanished. In the weeks following her disappearance, his desk became a battlefield of competing priorities: the paperwork from a meth lab bust outside Alma, a volatile domestic dispute that required constant follow-up, and an ongoing string of equipment thefts plaguing the county's farms. Sarah's case was just one more folder in a growing stack, another demand on time already divided too many ways. The Michigan State Police had offered to assist, but Morrison declined. Accepting help meant surrendering control, and he wasn't about to let Lansing swoop in and dictate how things were handled in his county. Meanwhile, Linda Chen's relentless determination had become a daily fixture at the sheriff's department. At first, her persistence inspired sympathy. Then it began to wear on the deputy's patience. She called multiple times a day, dropped in without appointments, and arrived every morning at precisely 11 o'clock, clutching fresh printouts, articles, maps, theories gathered from internet crime forums and online sleuths. Her visits were a painful reminder of a case that refused to move forward. Before long, deputies began adjusting their lunch breaks to avoid her predictable appearances. Morrison told himself she was grieving, but privately her intensity grated against his instinct for order. Outside the sheriff's office, Sarah's disappearance had become the center of a small-town storm. It exposed the subtle fault lines in Millbrook's identity, a place caught uneasily between its agricultural roots and the slow crawl of suburban expansion. The old families, the Pattersons, the Vances, the Kowalskis, whose ancestors had tilled the same fields for generations, regarded newcomers with cautious politeness and quiet mistrust. Derek Martinez, despite having lived in Millbrook for 3 years, was still an outsider, a transplant from Grand Rapids with no family ties to the land, no long history of church potlucks or harvest festivals to vouch for him. Sarah occupied an even more precarious place. She was bright, ambitious, a nursing student with aspirations that clearly stretched far beyond the borders of Gracie County. To some, that made her admirable. To others, it made her suspect. It didn't take long for the whispers to start, rumors that maybe she'd left by choice. Maybe the locked doors and the eerie stillness were all a setup, an elaborate way to slip quietly out of her life without breaking Derek's heart. But the deeper Morrison and his team dug, the more contradictions they uncovered. Not dramatic breakthroughs, just small inconsistencies that painted an unsettling picture of how Millbrook really functioned. Residents admitted they rarely locked their doors, despite the rash of burglaries that had convinced Sarah to install her deadbolt. Mrs. Vance, the neighbor who'd seen Sarah last, confessed that she'd noticed strange vehicles parked along County Road 21 several times that January, sedans and pickup trucks she didn't recognize, but she hadn't thought to write down the license plates or descriptions. It was the kind of town where people noticed everything but questioned nothing, where gossip spread faster than truth, and where everyone swore they wanted answers, so long as those answers didn't point too close to home. The volunteer fire department's search and rescue training consisted primarily of finding lost hunters during deer season, not conducting systematic searches for missing persons in winter conditions. These admissions embarrassed a community that prided itself on self-sufficiency and looking out for neighbors. Most disturbing were the details that emerged about Sarah's final weeks. Classmates from her nursing program revealed that she'd seemed increasingly anxious about something she wouldn't discuss. Her supervisor at the county hospital mentioned that Sarah had asked several unusual questions about patient confidentiality and reporting requirements. 3 different residents recalled seeing Sarah having what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone in the parking lot outside Millbrook Market during the first week of February, but no one could identify the other person or recall specific details about what they witnessed. The town's response to media attention further revealed its protective instincts. When a television crew from Lansing arrived in early March to film a segment about Sarah's disappearance, many residents suddenly became unavailable for interviews.
Store owners claimed to be too busy to talk. Neighbors developed selective amnesia about timeline details they'd freely shared with police. The reporter, frustrated by the wall of silence, characterized Millbrook as a community more interested in protecting its reputation than finding a missing young woman. The broadcast aired during the dinner hour on a Tuesday evening, ensuring that everyone in town watched their neighbors' faces as carefully as they listened to the reporter's words, looking for signs of betrayal or secrets finally exposed. The crime scene photographs from February 15, 2003 captured a world transformed by winter's violence. Deputy Wallace had arrived at Sarah Chan's rental house just after sunrise. His department-issued camera produced stark black and white images that would be scrutinized for decades. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an eerily pristine landscape where every footprint, every disturbance, every anomaly stood out against the unmarked snow like evidence written in a language investigators couldn't yet read. The photographic record began with the house itself, a modest single-story ranch typical of 1970s construction, its brown aluminum siding and narrow windows giving it the anonymous appearance of temporary housing. Snow had drifted against the north wall, reaching nearly to the windowsills, while the wind had scoured the south side almost clean. Deputy Wallace approached the scene with the precision of a man who had built his career on noticing what others overlooked. Every doorway, every latch, every inch of weathered frame received his full attention. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, its steel frame intact, the deadbolt operating exactly as it should. The back door told the same story, untouched, its chain lock still fastened just as Derek claimed he'd found it. The windows, though warped and stiff from years of paint and cold, remained latched tight. There was no shattered glass, no disturbed snow at the sills, no indication that anyone had come or gone through them. If the house itself offered no answers, the snow outside told a different kind of story, one whose significance would not be understood for years to come. Wallace moved methodically, camera in hand, documenting every footprint with the patience of ritual. Derek's size 11 boots left heavy, chaotic impressions between the car and the front door, looping around the perimeter where he'd frantically searched for any sign of Sarah. Mrs. Vance's smaller prints traced a neat path between her kitchen door and the property line where she had passed the borrowed mug to Sarah earlier that night. And then there were Sarah's tracks. They began clearly in Mrs. Vance's yard, delicate but distinct, the crisp imprints of size 7 winter boots pressing into the fresh snow. The tread left a recognizable waffle pattern, one Derek immediately identified as hers. Forensic photography captured every detail, the consistent stride length, the depth of each step, the subtle outward turn of her right foot, the result of an old basketball injury from high school. The story of her walk home was written perfectly in the snow. Until it wasn't. 15 feet from her front door, Sarah's tracks ended. Not blurred by wind, not filled in by falling snow, simply stopped, as if she had vanished mid-step, lifted cleanly from the earth into the storm-darkened air. Wallace crouched in the cold silence, staring at the abrupt cutoff where the final footprint gave way to untouched white. He took extra photographs, double-checked his angles, and then photographed them again. Nothing about it made sense. When the state police arrived the next day, February 16th, they brought equipment better suited for city crime scenes than a frozen Michigan field. Tripods, luminol kits, trace evidence vacuums. They moved with the uneasy precision of people trying to apply textbook procedure to something that defied logic. Technicians collected snow samples from the area where Sarah's tracks ended, sealing each one carefully in sterile containers. They hoped for hair fibers, fragments of fabric, traces of skin oil, anything that could explain the impossible. The samples were sent to Lansing, where the state lab promised answers within weeks. But when the results arrived, they offered only disappointment and confusion. The analysis revealed nothing, no biological material, no chemical anomalies, no sign of a struggle.
Just frozen precipitation, faint traces of agricultural runoff, and the sterile silence of absence. Still, one small discovery kept investigators awake long after the case file began to gather dust. The snow itself could hold time. Its density, layering, and moisture patterns formed a record of the storm's progression, a natural timestamp. And if that record could be decoded, it might tell them not just how Sarah vanished, but when. Meteorological records showed that the blizzard had intensified around 9 p.m. on February 14th, with heavy snowfall continuing until approximately 3 a.m. on the 15th. The accumulation rate meant that any tracks made earlier in the evening would have been partially or completely obscured by morning. Yet Sarah's footprints remained clearly visible, indicating they'd been made during the final hours of the storm. This timing corroborated Mrs. Vance's testimony about when Sarah had left her house, but it made the mystery of her disappearance even more profound. Inside the rental house, evidence collection revealed the eerie normality of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Sarah's anatomy textbook lay open to a chapter on cardiovascular system disorders, her handwritten notes filling the margins in her characteristic precise script. A half-eaten bowl of tomato soup sat cooling on the kitchen counter, the spoon still resting against its ceramic rim. Her cell phone showed no unusual activity, no calls, no text messages, no internet searches that might hint at plans or concerns. The last entry in her daily planner, written in blue ink that hadn't yet dried, simply read, V-Day dinner with D, excited. Forensic examination of the house's interior produced results that were simultaneously thorough and frustrating. Fingerprint analysis revealed exactly what investigators expected. Sarah's prints throughout the residence, Derek's in common areas in the bedroom they shared, and a few additional prints belonging to landlord maintenance personnel. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry or violent encounter, no indication that anything unusual had occurred inside the house. The scene suggested that Sarah had simply walked outside and vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved tableau of domestic normality. The physical evidence from February 2003 would be cataloged, analyzed, and stored in the Gracie County Sheriff's Department's evidence room, where it would remain largely untouched for nearly 2 decades, waiting for technology and perspective that didn't yet exist to unlock its secrets. The first break in Sarah Chen's case came 11 days after her disappearance, when a convenience store clerk in Bay City called the tip line to report a young Asian woman matching Sarah's description. The woman had purchased coffee and gasoline around midnight on February 15th. The clerk explained that she'd seemed nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly while counting out exact change. Detective Morrison drove the 130 miles to Bay City with Linda silently in the passenger seat, both of them afraid to hope too loudly. The surveillance footage from the gas station showed a woman of approximately Sarah's height and build, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail similar to how Sarah typically wore hers. But when the clerk viewed the video alongside Morrison and Linda, his certainty crumbled. The woman's face remained obscured by the camera angle and poor lighting. Her coat was navy blue rather than red, and her mannerisms didn't match the nervous energy he'd described. Linda stared at the grainy footage until her eyes watered, willing it to be her daughter. But deep in her chest, she knew the truth before Morrison spoke it aloud. This wasn't Sarah. This was just another woman living her own life, unaware that her late-night gas purchase had briefly carried the hopes of a desperate mother. The Bay City lead established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the following months. A waitress in Flint reported serving someone who looked like Sarah. A bus driver in Detroit remembered a quiet passenger who'd paid with exact change and avoided eye contact. A hotel clerk in Traverse City insisted he'd checked in a young woman matching Sarah's description, though the registration record showed a completely different name, and the security cameras had been broken for weeks. Each tip required investigation, each investigation consumed precious resources, and each dead end pushed Sarah's case further toward the growing pile of unsolved files in Morrison's office. By summer 2003, the investigation had expanded beyond Michigan's borders. Reports trickled in from Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Sightings of young Asian women who might be Sarah Chen, living under assumed names, working cash jobs, staying one step ahead of detection. Morrison dutifully followed each lead, driving thousands of miles and conducting hundreds of interviews with people who ultimately had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. The investigation consumed his patrol budget and strained relationships with neighboring law enforcement agencies who grew tired of wild goose chases that yielded nothing but wasted time. The most promising lead came in August when a social worker in Chicago contacted the Gracie County Sheriff's Department about a client who'd enrolled in a homeless services program using identification that appeared fraudulent. The woman claimed to be from Michigan, had visible nursing skills when helping other clients with medical issues, and seemed terrified when anyone asked about her past. Morrison and Linda made the 6-hour drive to Chicago, only to discover that the woman was actually Elena Vasquez, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who'd purchased fake identification to escape an abusive relationship. Elena Vance's fear had little to do with the mystery of a missing girl or the locked house across the yard. Her fear was older, quieter, and far more personal. It came from the knowledge that any wrong move could expose her secret. Her expired visa, her real name, the abusive husband back in Moscow who had put her in the hospital twice before she fled. So when the police began asking questions, Elena's voice trembled, not from guilt over what she'd seen, but from the terror of what might happen if she told too much. For her, the nightmare of Sarah Chen's disappearance was only one of many dangers waiting to resurface. Inside the sheriff's department, the case was unraveling in ways no one wanted to admit. False leads piled up like drifted snow, each one melting into nothing, leaving behind only frustration and doubt. The psychological strain began to wear down even the veterans. Detective Morrison, who had once prided himself on being steady under pressure, started to feel the slow erosion of confidence. He'd built a career on solving cases that ended neatly, with arrests, confessions, closure. But this case defied structure. It bled into every corner of his mind, keeping him awake at night, questioning his instincts, his judgment, even his competence. By midsummer, Morrison had begun letting Linda Chan's calls go to voicemail. He couldn't bear the sound of her voice, gentle but trembling with desperate hope, asking if there was any news, any sign, any trace. Each conversation ended the same way, with silence. And every unanswered question felt like another small betrayal. The state police, once eager to demonstrate their expertise, slowly withdrew as months passed without progress. Personnel were reassigned to fresher cases, crimes with clearer evidence and faster resolutions. What had once been a statewide search for a missing woman gradually shrank to a few overworked deputies revisiting old notes and rewalking familiar snow-covered fields. By the time autumn's chill gave way to another winter, Millbrook had changed. The posters with Sarah's smiling face had faded and curled at the corners. Fewer volunteers came out for the anniversary search that February, their shovels and flashlights replaced by resignation. The headlines grew smaller, the public interest colder. Sarah's first anniversary passed without ceremony, just a brief mention in the Gracie County Tribune, a few lines beneath a story about a high school basketball tournament. Through it all, one name remained on Morris's desk, circled in red: Derek Martinez. 17 interviews, each one different in tone, strategy, and approach. Morrison tried everything: empathy, intimidation, silence, even feigned friendship. But Derek's story never changed. No inconsistencies, no confessions, just the same haunted expression, the same quiet insistence that he had no idea what happened that night. And yet, Morrison couldn't let him go. Because in a case with no evidence, no witnesses, and no logical explanation, Derek Martinez was the only variable that made sense, and the only one that refused to break. Derek's story never changed. He'd waited for Sarah to return from Mrs. Vance's house, grown worried when she didn't come back, discovered the house was locked and empty, and called police immediately. Polygraph tests proved inconclusive, neither clearing nor implicating him. His alibi for the 47 minutes of Sarah's disappearance remained what it had always been. He was alone in the house. In a case built on impossibilities, Derek's loneliness during those crucial minutes became both his strongest defense and his greatest vulnerability. By February 2004, exactly 1 year after Sarah's disappearance, her case had been quietly reclassified as a cold case. The active investigation was suspended, though Morrison assured Linda that any new evidence would receive immediate attention. The promise felt hollow to everyone involved, including Morrison himself, who knew that cold cases in rural Michigan often stayed cold forever, buried beneath accumulating paperwork and newer emergencies that demanded immediate resources. Detective James "Jimmy" Sullivan hadn't intended to inherit Sarah Chen's case when he transferred to the Gracie County Sheriff's Department in September 2005, 2.5 years after Sarah's disappearance. He was looking for the quieter pace that rural policing promised after 15 years with the Michigan State Police. Sullivan had worked major crime scenes, supervised multi-jurisdictional task forces, and testified in capital murder trials. At 42, with 2 failed marriages behind him and a drinking problem he'd recently conquered, he wanted cases involving stolen farm equipment and domestic disputes, not mysteries that consumed careers and destroyed personal lives. But Sarah Chen's file drew him back repeatedly during his first weeks on the job. Morrison had left behind meticulously organized evidence boxes, interview transcripts, and photograph albums, all stored in the basement evidence room like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Sullivan told himself he was simply familiarizing himself with the department's major unsolved cases, performing due diligence that any competent detective would undertake. Yet he found himself staying late, reading witness statements by the harsh fluorescent lights, studying crime scene photographs until the details were burned into his memory like religious iconography. The impossibility of Sarah's disappearance violated everything Sullivan understood about criminal investigation. People didn't vanish from locked houses without leaving trace evidence. Young women didn't disappear during blizzards without someone seeing or hearing something unusual. Unusual cases didn't remain completely devoid of viable suspects or logical explanations after years of competent police work. Sullivan had solved murders where the only evidence was a single hair fiber and had tracked down suspects using nothing but witness descriptions of unusual mannerisms. But Sarah Chen's case offered none of the forensic breadcrumbs that usually lead investigators from crime scene to courtroom. Sullivan's obsession began innocuously enough. He started by re-interviewing key witnesses, telling himself he was simply updating their statements and checking for details that might have been overlooked. Mrs. Vance, now in her 70s and increasingly frail, repeated her story exactly as she told it dozens of times before. Derek Martinez, who'd moved back to Grand Rapids and found work as an automotive technician, answered Sullivan's questions with the weary patience of someone who'd long since stopped expecting to be believed. Linda Chen, who'd exhausted her savings and moved back to Lansing, greeted Sullivan's renewed interest with desperate hope tempered by years of disappointment. The detective's personal life began to reflect his professional preoccupation. Sullivan's modest rental house in nearby Ithaca became a secondary crime scene, his spare bedroom converted into an unofficial investigation headquarters. He tacked crime scene photographs to the walls, spread timeline charts across a folding table purchased from a garage sale, and filled filing cabinets with copies of evidence reports that he read and reread until the pages grew soft from handling. His refrigerator contained more takeout containers than fresh food, and his sleep became fragmented by dreams filled with footprints that ended in unmarked snow.
Sullivan's colleagues began to notice his fixation. Sheriff Patricia Hayes, who'd hired him specifically for his experience with complex cases, initially encouraged his fresh perspective on the Chen investigation. But as months passed and Sullivan's attention to other cases suffered, she grew concerned about his mental health and professional effectiveness. Sullivan missed court dates because he was re-examining evidence, arrived late for shifts after spending nights driving the rural roads around Millbrook looking for details that previous investigators might have missed. And his reports on routine cases grew perfunctory while his Sarah Chen files expanded exponentially. The detective's breakthrough, or breakdown depending on perspective, came during a January 2007 snowstorm that reminded him of the night Sarah disappeared. Sullivan had been examining the original crime scene photographs for what felt like the 1,000th time when something about the snow patterns finally clicked. The accumulation around Sarah's rental house wasn't random.
It showed subtle signs of disturbance that the 2003 investigators had dismissed as wind effects. Sullivan spent the next 6 hours measuring angles and calculating wind speeds from Weather Service archives, eventually convincing himself that someone had deliberately altered the snow to obscure evidence. When Sullivan presented his theory to Sheriff Hayes, complete with meteorological charts and geometric calculations, she realized that Sarah Chen's case had claimed another victim. The detective who transferred to Gracie County seeking peace had instead found a mystery that was slowly destroying his objectivity and his career. Hayes faced an impossible choice: remove Sullivan from the case he'd made his life's work, or watch a competent investigator disappear down the same rabbit hole that had frustrated Morrison and heartbroken Linda Chen. Sarah's case, it seemed, had the power to consume anyone who stared too deeply into its void, transforming rational professionals into obsessed seekers chasing shadows through endless Michigan winters. Sullivan's investigation had reached the same dead end that had claimed Morrison, but his refusal to accept defeat would prove to be exactly what Sarah's case needed, though neither he nor anyone else could have predicted the path that obsession would eventually illuminate. Detective Jimmy Sullivan's salvation came in the form of a phone call from the Michigan State Police Laboratory on March 15, 2019. 16 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance and 12 years after Sullivan's obsession with her case had nearly cost him his career. Dr. Angela Martinez, a forensic DNA analyst who'd never heard of Millbrook or Gracie County, was calling about evidence samples that had been sitting in frozen storage since 2003, waiting for technology that hadn't existed when they were first collected. The samples consisted of fabric fibers recovered from Sarah's red winter coat, which had been found hanging in her bedroom closet the morning after her disappearance. Original testing in 2003 had identified the fibers as cotton blend, likely from another person's clothing. But DNA extraction technology at the time couldn't produce a usable profile from such minimal material. The fibers had been cataloged, stored, and essentially forgotten until Dr. Martinez's team began working through a backlog of cold case evidence using enhanced extraction techniques that could isolate genetic material from increasingly smaller samples. Sullivan, now 56 years old and serving as the department's senior detective, had weathered the years of frustration better than anyone expected. Sheriff Hayes had ultimately decided to let him pursue Sarah's case as a secondary assignment, reasoning that his expertise was too valuable to waste and his obsession too deep to cure through reassignment. Sullivan had solved dozens of other cases during the intervening years, but Sarah Chen remained the investigation that defined his career and haunted his dreams. When Dr. Martinez called, Sullivan was reviewing financial records from a recent embezzlement case, his mind occupied with mundane details about missing petty cash and altered receipts. The DNA profile recovered from the fabric fibers was partial but significant: 13 genetic markers that would be sufficient to identify a suspect if they had a sample for comparison. More importantly, the profile was male, which eliminated several theories that investigators had pursued over the years. Dr. Martinez explained that the enhanced testing had also revealed trace amounts of an unusual soap residue on the fibers, a commercial-grade cleanser typically used in institutional settings like hospitals, schools, or government buildings. The combination of DNA evidence and chemical analysis provided the first concrete leads in Sarah's case since the initial crime scene investigation. Sullivan's hands shook as he wrote down Dr. Martinez's findings, his careful notes betraying the excitement he tried to keep from his voice. After 16 years of dead ends and false leads, science was finally offering answers to questions that had consumed his professional life. The DNA profile would be entered into the combined DNA index system, where it would be compared against millions of samples from convicted criminals, crime scene evidence, and voluntary submissions. But Sullivan knew that CODIS matches were rare in cold cases, and he began planning his own systematic approach to identifying the source of the mysterious DNA. The detective's renewed investigation focused on people who'd had access to Sarah during her final weeks, particularly those who worked in institutional settings that would explain the commercial soap residue. Sarah's nursing rotations had placed her in contact with dozens of hospital staff members, maintenance workers, and security personnel. Her part-time job at a medical supply company had involved interactions with delivery drivers, warehouse employees, and administrative staff. Each contact represented a potential source for the DNA sample, but tracking down individuals from 16 years earlier proved nearly impossible. People had died, moved away, or simply disappeared into lives that left no forwarding addresses. Sullivan's breakthrough came when he decided to expand his search beyond Sarah's known associates to include anyone who'd been questioned during the original investigation. He spent weeks digitizing old interview files, creating a database of everyone who'd provided statements or been considered as potential witnesses. The list included neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and dozens of people who'd simply been in the wrong place at the right time to draw police attention. Cross-referencing this list against employment records from institutions using commercial-grade cleansers produced 13 possible matches. The process of collecting DNA samples from potential suspects required delicate negotiation between constitutional rights and investigative necessity. Sullivan couldn't simply demand genetic samples from people who'd been charged with crimes, but he could request voluntary submissions and collect discarded materials that suspects left in public places. The work was tedious and often felt like an invasion of privacy that yielded no results. 8 of the 13 potential matches provided voluntary DNA samples that were quickly eliminated through laboratory comparison. 3 others proved impossible to locate or contact. The 13th name on Sullivan's list belonged to someone he'd never considered as a suspect, someone whose connection to Sarah seemed so peripheral that their DNA sample had been collected almost as an afterthought. When the laboratory called with the results of that comparison, Dr. Martinez's voice carried an excitement that matched Sullivan's own growing anticipation. The DNA profile was a perfect match. All 13 genetic markers aligned with the evidence recovered from Sarah's coat. After 16 years of questions without answers, science had finally offered answers to the person who'd been in physical contact with Sarah Chen during her final hours.
The revelation would shatter everything the community believed about the night she disappeared. But first, Sullivan had to confront the implications of what the DNA evidence actually meant. The name that appeared on Detective Sullivan's computer screen at 2:47 p.m. on April 3, 2019, belonged to someone who'd lived in plain sight for 16 years, someone who'd attended Sarah Chen's memorial service, someone who'd expressed sympathy to Linda Chen and offered assistance during the early days of the investigation. Robert Bob Vance, Mrs. Elena Vance's 68-year-old nephew, had been questioned briefly in 2003 as part of the routine canvass of Sarah's neighborhood, but his alibi had seemed ironclad and his demeanor had raised no suspicions. Sullivan stared at the DNA match confirmation until the letters blurred together, his mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he knew about Sarah's case. Bob Vance worked as a maintenance supervisor at the Gracie County Medical Center, which explained the commercial-grade soap residue found on the fabric fibers. He lived just 3 miles from Sarah's rental house and had unrestricted access to his aunt's property, including the spare key she kept hidden under his back porch flower pot. More disturbing still, Bob had been present in Mrs. Vance's kitchen on the evening of February 14, 2003, ostensibly helping his elderly aunt prepare for the blizzard by bringing her groceries and checking her heating system. The detective's review of the original case files revealed details that had seemed innocuous in 2003, but now carried sinister implications. Mrs. Vance had mentioned that Bob was always so thoughtful, arriving unannounced to help with household tasks and staying late to ensure she was comfortable during harsh weather. Bob had volunteered to join early search parties, spending hours trudging through snow-covered fields and abandoned buildings, ostensibly looking for Sarah, while knowing exactly where she wouldn't be found. He'd even provided comfort to Derek Martinez during those first desperate weeks, sharing coffee and offering the kind of mail support that Derek's friends and family struggled to provide. Sullivan's investigation into Bob Vance's background revealed a carefully constructed facade that had fooled everyone, including trained law enforcement personnel. Bob was known throughout Millbrook as a reliable handyman who helped elderly residents with home repairs, a church usher who never missed Sunday service, and a devoted nephew who'd cared for his aunt since his uncle's death in 1998.
His employment record at the medical center showed exemplary performance over 23 years, with supervisors describing him as dependable, quiet, and respected by staff and patients alike. Bob's only criminal history consisted of a single speeding ticket from 1995 and a minor citation for burning leaves without a permit in 2001. But deeper investigation revealed disturbing patterns that had been invisible to casual observers. Hospital staff members, when questioned carefully, admitted that Bob had shown unusual interest in young female employees, particularly nursing students who rotated through various departments. Several women recalled conversations where Bob had asked personal questions about their schedules, living arrangements, and transportation habits. Most had dismissed his curiosity as awkward attempts at friendliness from a lonely older man, but in the context of Sarah's disappearance, his behavior took on a more predatory character. Sullivan discovered that Bob's access to the medical center's facilities extended far beyond normal working hours. His maintenance position required him to respond to emergency calls, giving him legitimate reasons to be in the building during evenings, weekends, and holidays. Security camera footage from 2003 had been routinely destroyed years earlier, but employment records showed that Bob had worked late shifts during January and February 2003, including the evening of Sarah's disappearance. Hospital policy allowed maintenance staff to use facility vehicles for emergency calls, providing Bob with transportation that wouldn't have been tracked or questioned during a blizzard. The most chilling discovery came when Sullivan examined Bob's relationship with his aunt more closely. Mrs. Vance, now 86 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia, had always portrayed her nephew as her protector and closest family member. But nursing home staff, where she'd lived since 2017, reported that Mrs. Vance sometimes became agitated when discussing her nephew, muttering about secrets and things Bob made me promise not to tell. Her condition made her an unreliable witness, but Sullivan wondered what truths might be trapped behind her deteriorating memory. Sullivan spent sleepless nights reconstructing what might have happened on February 14, 2003. Bob Vance could have been at his aunt's house when Sarah arrived to return the borrowed mug. He might have offered to walk her home through the blizzard, using his position as Mrs. Vance's trusted nephew to gain Sarah's confidence. With access to his aunt's spare key, Bob could have followed Sarah into her house, confronted her there, and then staged the scene to make her disappearance appear impossible. The locked doors and undisturbed snow were not evidence of supernatural intervention, but proof of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a crime scene to confuse investigators. The DNA evidence provided the crucial link between Bob Vance and Sarah Chen, but proving what had happened during those 47 minutes required more than genetic markers. Sullivan needed to find Sarah's body, uncover additional evidence of Bob's involvement, and build a case strong enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges 16 years after the fact. The investigation that had consumed his career was finally approaching its conclusion, but the most difficult work still lay ahead. Detective Sullivan's surveillance of Robert Vance began on April 8, 2019, 5 days after the DNA match confirmation arrived from the state laboratory. Sullivan parked his unmarked sedan across the street from Bob's modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, watching through binoculars as the 68-year-old man maintained the same routine he'd followed for decades. Bob left for work at the medical center at 6 a.m., returned home at 3:30 p.m., and spent his evenings watching television through windows that never quite closed their curtains all the way. To neighbors and co-workers, Bob appeared unchanged, still the quiet, reliable handyman who'd lived in Millbrook since childhood. But Sullivan noticed details that spoke to a man under enormous psychological pressure. Bob's hands shook when he unlocked his front door each evening, fumbling with keys he'd handled thousands of times before. His garbage bins, previously organized with military precision, now overflowed with empty whiskey bottles and takeout containers from restaurants he'd never patronized.
What spoke loudest in the weeks following the DNA results weren't Bob's words, but his rituals. Every evening, just before dusk, he drove his rusted blue pickup to Millbrook Cemetery. What had once been a quiet weekly visit to his aunt's grave had grown into a daily compulsion, an unspoken confession performed beneath the weathered oak trees that bordered the cemetery fence. Detective Sullivan watched from a distance, hidden behind the long lens of a surveillance camera.
Through the scope, he saw Bob kneel in the snow-streaked grass beside Mrs. Vance's headstone, his head bowed, his lips moving in conversations no one else could hear. Sometimes his shoulders trembled with the effort of silent sobs. Sometimes he simply stared at the name etched in stone, unmoving, as if waiting for it to speak back. Guilt, Sullivan thought, was a living thing, and in Bob, it was consuming him slowly. The detective knew the confrontation had to be timed with surgical precision. Push too early, and Bob might retreat, destroy evidence, or disappear entirely. Wait too long, and the fragile psychological thread holding him together could snap, leaving him incoherent and useless as a witness to his own crimes. Sullivan resolved to tighten the noose carefully, incremental pressure masked as professional courtesy. A few routine questions, a friendly check-in, a reminder that the past was never as buried as people like to believe. The first official interview took place on April 15th in a small windowless office at the Millbrook Medical Center where Bob worked as a maintenance supervisor. The meeting had been scheduled under the pretense of a standard cold case review, just another procedural sweep through old evidence and statements from 2003. Bob agreed without hesitation, greeting Sullivan with the same calm professionalism that had characterized his behavior 16 years earlier. But the calm didn't last. Almost immediately, Sullivan noticed the microfractures. Bob's breathing was shallow and uneven, his fingers laced tightly in his lap as though physically restraining their tremor. His eyes flickered again and again toward the door, not in boredom, but in calculation. Escape routes, contingency plans. His polite smile had the brittle, glassy edge of someone who no longer trusted the ground beneath him. Then, Sullivan mentioned the phrase that cracked the surface, new forensic techniques. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Bob's composure began to erode in increments, a tightening of the jaw, a swallow too quick, the brief flash of fear behind his carefully controlled expression. His once precise recollection of February 14, 2003 grew suddenly uncertain. Timeline shifted, details blurred. He contradicted himself in small but telling ways, whether he'd seen Sarah that evening, when he'd left work, what time he'd last spoken to Mrs. Vance. And then came the true giveaway. Without prompting, Bob began offering explanations for things Sullivan hadn't even asked about. Why he'd been near the cemetery that weekend, why certain tools were missing from the maintenance shed, why his truck's mileage didn't match his work log. Each unnecessary clarification dug him deeper, the desperate maneuvering of a guilty conscience trying to outrun the inevitable. Sullivan didn't interrupt. He simply let Bob talk, his calm silence doing the work that direct accusation could not. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be forced. It only needs to be given enough quiet to collapse under its own weight. The psychological pressure intensified during Sullivan's second interview 3 days later, when the detective revealed that DNA evidence had been recovered from fabric fibers found on Sarah's clothing. Bob's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, his hands began trembling uncontrollably, and he excused himself to use the restroom where Sullivan could hear him vomiting through the thin walls. When Bob returned, his carefully constructed facade was cracking visibly, revealing glimpses of the torment he'd carried for 16 years. Sullivan's breakthrough came during the third interview on April 22nd, when he informed Bob that the DNA profile had produced a match. The detective didn't immediately identify Bob as that match. Instead, he watched as the 68-year-old man's psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. Bob's breathing became labored, his skin took on a grayish pallor, and his entire body began shaking as if he was experiencing a seizure. But instead of denial or demands for legal representation, Bob whispered words that Sullivan had been waiting 16 years to hear. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Sarah was such a sweet girl. She didn't deserve what I did to her." The confession that followed was fragmented and emotional, punctuated by sobs and long periods of silence as Bob struggled to articulate actions he'd kept secret for more than half his life. But gradually, piece by piece, the truth about February 14, 2003 began emerging from the psychological wreckage of a man who could no longer carry the weight of his crime. The arrest of Robert Vance on April 24, 2019, shattered Millbrook's carefully maintained equilibrium like a stone thrown through stained glass. Sheriff Hayes had coordinated with the prosecutor's office to ensure that formal charges would be filed immediately after Bob's confession, but nothing could have prepared the community for the psychological earthquake that followed the revelation that Sarah Chen's killer had been living among them for 16 years, offering comfort to her grieving mother and participating in search parties for a young woman he'd already murdered. Linda Chen received the news at her apartment in Lansing, where she'd been preparing for another day at the factory where she'd worked since exhausting her savings during the early years of Sarah's disappearance. Detective Sullivan called her at 6 a.m., his voice heavy with emotions he'd learned to suppress during decades of law enforcement work. Linda's first reaction was silence, so complete that Sullivan initially thought the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her words came in fragments, questions about evidence and DNA and whether Sarah's body had been recovered, interspersed with sobs that seemed to emerge from someplace deeper than grief, a region of maternal anguish that had been frozen for 16 years and was now thawing with devastating intensity. Bob's confession had provided crucial details about Sarah's final moments, but his psychological breakdown made it impossible to determine which elements represented accurate memory and which were products of guilt-induced fantasy. He claimed that he'd followed Sarah from his aunt's house on the pretense of helping her navigate the blizzard, that he'd used Mrs. Vance's spare key to enter Sarah's rental house, and that he'd confronted her with sexual intentions that she'd rejected. The physical struggle that followed had ended when Sarah struck her head against the kitchen counter, an injury that Bob insisted was accidental, but which proved fatal within minutes. According to Bob's fragmented account, he'd spent hours in Sarah's house deciding what to do with her body, eventually loading her into his medical center maintenance truck and driving to a location he described only as where she could rest peacefully now. His efforts to stage the scene had included locking all doors from inside before exiting through a basement window, then carefully obscuring his own tracks in the snow while preserving Sarah's footprints to create the impression that she'd vanished impossibly. The deception had required intimate knowledge of crime scene investigation, which Bob had acquired through years of watching forensic television shows and reading true crime books. An irony that wasn't lost on investigators who'd been mystified by the scene's seemingly impossibility. The community's reaction to Bob's arrest revealed fault lines that had remained hidden for decades. People who'd known Bob since childhood struggled to reconcile the helpful handyman with the calculated killer described in police reports. In Millbrook, news travels faster than forgiveness. By the time the evening broadcast ended, half the town already knew that Bob Vance, the man who'd fixed their porch lights, shoveled their driveways, and waved from his truck every morning, had been arrested for Sarah Chen's disappearance. Mrs. Patterson, whose late husband Earl had always sworn there was something off about Bob, wasted no time reminding everyone of his instincts. She said she'd felt it in her bones for years, that kind of unease that clings to a person even when you can't name why. But others were far less certain. For many of Millbrook's elderly residents, Bob had been their quiet savior, the dependable handyman who never overcharged, who showed up in blizzards, who mowed their lawns when their sons had long since stopped visiting. The revelation hit them hardest. It wasn't just disbelief they felt, it was betrayal. A questioning of everything they thought they understood about goodness, about familiarity, about the kind of evil that wears a friendly smile. When Derek Martinez's phone rang that night, he was at home in Grand Rapids, putting his youngest to bed. His sister's voice came through the line, trembling as she told him she'd seen the news report. For a moment, Derek couldn't move. He sat down on the edge of his son's bed, the cartoon nightlight flickering against his face, and felt something inside him loosen, a knot he hadn't realized had been tied so tightly for so long. Relief came first, sharp and blinding, followed by vindication. But beneath it all was a deep, weary sadness, one that had nothing to do with Bob's guilt and everything to do with the years already lost. For 16 years, Derek had lived under the silent judgment of neighbors and colleagues who looked at him and saw a question mark. No matter how often he cooperated with investigators, no matter how patiently he endured the rumors, there had always been someone whispering in the background